Well, what I was going to do was get you all to turn to each other and say what your worst ever Christmas present you'd received was. But seeing as we've already done something like that already, what we'll do is we'll save that for another time, and that'll be a fun thing to think about. I couldn't think of mine earlier when someone asked me this question. Apart from 1 year, I got given a giant chair for some reason. And I had no room in my bedroom at the time. I was living with my parents in this tiny little space. Well, it wasn't that tiny, but tiny enough for me. I felt like it was too small. I'm 6'4", it was too much. And actually I ended up using it more than anything else I've ever received before. And it lives in my flat now. So whoever bought me that present, because I can't remember who it was, thank you if you're watching on the camera at the back there. Really helpfully, I've already been introduced. I'm Johnny, I'm a student pastor, I'm an ordinand, and I'm exhausted. It's been a long day. Family carols was kind of crazy this morning with the donkey and the horse and Batman and Superman and Spider-Man and Jesus Man and a few other people. It was really awesome though. We had a lot of fun. So, if you're joining us in the middle of our series at the moment, we have been going through a number of topics that you guys said to us that you wanted to learn more about. We did a survey a few months ago, which a lot of you took part in, and within that survey we asked, what do you want to grow most? And we got 5 results back. So we called it, You Asked For It, which kind of sounds a bit aggressive, doesn't it? Sounds like we're going to hit you. And I might if you don't listen. So pay attention. It will be a love tap. No, that's weird, isn't it? Let's move on. So, I don't know what that is. Oh, it's a good start. So over the last few weeks, we've got clued up on praying, we've got clued up on how to read the Bible, how to grow in holiness, and it's been left to me tonight to speak about mission. And after a bit of preamble, I just want to break down mission into 3 simple steps. Who, what, and why. Who is it for? What do we say? And why do we do it? Now, the word mission makes me think of all sorts of things. And when I was doing this, I couldn't help thinking of things like Marvel's Avengers, like Frodo and Sam going to destroy the ring. And of course, the whole week, I've been thinking of the Mission Impossible theme tune, or what I thought was the Mission Impossible theme tune until I Googled it and realized actually I was thinking of the James Bond theme tune, which just goes to show how screwed up my mind is. But in Christianity, mission generally involves a lot less explosions, generally, and more Jesus. And it's often followed by this word evangelism as well. And if you're just hearing these words for the first time tonight, then basically what we mean by that is that we intentionally go out from our churches to find people who don't know about Jesus. That's mission. And then we talk about him. That's evangelism. Very straightforward things to do. And when we think of mission, there are so many avenues that we could go down because there are so many different ways it can be done. Now, the Church of England, which is the organisation of churches that we here at St. Matt's are a part of, broke it down into 5 categories, which I think are pretty helpful. First of which is sharing about Jesus, followed by baptizing and supporting new believers, lovingly looking after others, challenging and transforming injustice in society, and looking after the planet. But because I think each of these ultimately incorporates the first point, this idea of sharing Jesus and speaking about him, whether in a big way in front of lots of people or just on a one-on-one, more intimate basis, that's what we're going to look at tonight. And the idea of doing this probably sounds pretty straightforward to some degree, but for some of us, speaking about Jesus outside of our Christian community is absolutely terrifying. Maybe we're afraid because we don't know what to say, or we know what to say, but we're worried that people might actually react badly to it. What I'm hoping tonight is that as we go on this journey together, that we might grow in confidence and reach a place where we say, I could do this with God's help. And when I look out over this congregation, I'm actually already encouraged because the very fact that we're speaking about this evening is because you wanted to know more about this topic. So whether you're hoping to speak about Jesus to your friends or your colleagues, your family members, or whether you're just hearing the name Jesus for the first time ever this evening and you start to think, actually, I'd like to tell some people about this guy too. He seems pretty awesome. Then sit back, relax, and let's turn to the Bible for some advice. And I want to read you some words from a guy called Paul, who was and is this massively influential character in the Bible, who speaks about mission and set up churches all over the known world at the time. And he spoke about his faith a lot and caused a lot of other people to come to know Jesus. So if you've got your Bible with you, you can pop it out now. We're going to be looking at Romans 10, verses 12 to 15, but the words are also going to appear on the screen as well, as they already have, which is super helpful. So, Paul writes this: Jew and Gentile are the same in this respect. They have the same Lord, who gives generously to all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. But how can they call on him to save them unless they believe in him? And how can they believe in him if they have never heard about him? And how can they hear about him unless someone tells them? And how will anyone go and tell them without being sent? And this is why the scriptures say, how beautiful are the feet of messengers who bring good news. So before we go into the main meat of what we're going to talk about tonight, what I'd encourage you to do now is just close your eyes. I'm just going to say a quick prayer as we kick off. Holy Spirit, as we think about this idea of talking about Jesus Christ, would you open our ears to what you have to say? Would you soften our hearts so they might be ready to receive? Would you start to plant seeds in our mind that can grow as we seek to grow in this area of mission? Amen. Cool. So, first of all, who are we trying to speak to? Now, in Paul's time and context, everyone in the ancient world fell into one of two categories for him. Jews, which Paul was, and the people that he'd grown up with. And they had all known this idea of having God, but mostly didn't believe in Jesus. And then there were Gentiles, who were basically anybody who wasn't a Jew. And they usually had about 1 million gods, depending on what day of the week it was. They had gods for literally everything. And if they didn't have a god for something, they just said, this is the God that we have for the thing that we haven't thought of yet. They were pretty good at covering all their bases. They mostly hadn't heard about Jesus either. And equally, in this bit of the Bible that we've just read, Paul is writing to a group of Christians in ancient Rome, where at this time, Christianity was only really just starting off. It had only been about 30 years or so since Jesus had died. And most of the people hadn't even got a reference point for the faith because it was just so new. And Paul issues this challenge to the church there. He says, how can the people of this city, whatever their background, believe in Jesus if they have never heard about him? That is a great question. And I think it's one that rings true for us here today, here in this church or in any Christian community across this country. He could just have easily been standing here right now saying, how can the people of Plymouth, whatever their background, believe in Jesus if they have never heard about him? And we live in a city not unlike first century Rome here in Plymouth. It's not probably quite as beautiful. We don't have the Colosseum, but we've got Plymouth Pavilions, so one of the 7 wonders of Plymouth. Someone tell me what the other 6 are and I will give you a prize. It'll be one of my hugs. So lovely, isn't it? It won't be. I don't like hugging people. Anyway, but there are a lot of people here in Plymouth who know next to nothing about Jesus because they've never heard about him. When we're here in this beautiful space on a Sunday, it probably doesn't feel like that really, does it? God has done some incredible work here to grow this Christian community to around something like 600-700 in the space of 3 years. That's a pretty quick time. But for the most part, when you step outside these 4 walls, the average person down Mutley Plain or at Plymouth University or at Marjons or Drake Circus has actually never heard about Jesus at all. And so Paul's question to Christians in Rome is as much a challenge to us now as it was to them 2,000 years ago. And on that basis, the people that most need to hear about Jesus is pretty much everybody. Job done. You're sorted. You know who to go to now. Just kidding. You're probably sat there thinking at this point, Johnny's gone insane. He's literally finally cracked under the pressure. But church ministry will do that to you, and you wouldn't be wrong. No. let's take a step back for a second. Obviously, you as an individual can't talk to literally everybody in this city. There's like 250,000 people. Even the 600-700 of us here in this church couldn't achieve that. Like, it just wouldn't be possible. However, individually, each of us has a sphere of influence within which we can work. It might be where we work. It might be where we study or exercise, where we shop, wherever really, to be honest, wherever you tend to spend the most of your time is somewhere that you could work in. And I'd encourage you to have a think before you leave here or over the coming week about perhaps one place where you think, yeah, I could actually totally look for people to speak to here. I'm out here all the time. People kind of know me a bit now, and I could open a conversation with them. Have a little think about that. So, we know that lots of people know absolutely nothing about Jesus. And we're aware that there are some specific places in our lives that have people in them who know nothing about Jesus. But now we've actually got to say something to them. But what? So our next question is, what do I say? Now, who loves to talk here? This is a survey. Who loves to talk? Put your hands up, the guilty parties. There's a lot of you. There's a lot of you who are not telling the truth as well. You love talking. Me too. I love to talk. I've got opinions and sarcastic quips for days. Just ask my colleagues. They know all about it. And if you want a long, persistent conversation with me, then ask me about laptops or mobile phones and which one you plan to buy next, and I will spend hours researching it and then bombarding you with information. And one of my friends recently, he broke his phone and foolishly, unknowingly, about not knowing this fact about me, asked me for some help to try and find a new phone. I chatted endlessly about it for about a week, about all the pros and cons of different handsets and the pricing things. Should you get refurbished? Should you buy brand new? Who knows? I know. I'll tell you about it. Don't you worry. And I got the impression that I might have been getting on his wick a bit because his phone was broken, he wasn't able to access like his Messenger account. And so he just would like occasionally get internet access at like his parents or something and then get like 50 messages come through for me about what he should be doing. I don't think he'll ask me that question again, to be honest. I half suspect he's got his phone back, but I've probably been blocked at this stage. But, all joking aside, if I was as passionate and persistent about Jesus on a daily basis as I am about helping people get new phones or laptops, I think everyone I know would be a Christian by now, although I'd probably need to find a lot less annoying way of doing it. In our passage, Paul challenges the church in Rome again. How can people hear about Jesus unless someone tells them? He's totally aware that nobody in Rome is going to hear about Jesus unless somebody is brave enough to open their mouth and actually speak about him. Paul is saying that whilst it's not impossible, it's highly unlikely that Janet or John are suddenly going to fall on their knees in Waterstones in Drake Circus and just have this incredible revelation of who God is, about his death and his Jesus' death and resurrection, full on Holy Spirit moment, crying, saying weird words, all that kind of stuff, repenting of their sins, without some sort of input from the outside. Again, not impossible because God is all powerful and so he could do that, but unlikely. I haven't seen it happen awfully often in my life. But have you ever noticed how much easier it can be to talk about stuff that isn't Jesus? It's like 1,000,000 times easier, isn't it, sometimes? And if I'm honest, sometimes I think the main factor that affects how I do this in my life is not so much not wanting to talk about Jesus, because I do. He's done some incredible stuff in my life that I want to tell people about. But it's more about not having the confidence to do so, or not necessarily knowing what to say when I get the chance. Picture this. You've arranged to meet a non-Christian friend of yours. And in your heart, you're so desperate for them to know about who Jesus is. But in your head, you are obsessing about what it is you should say. The possibility of thinking that you need to know complex theological terms. or believing that you just need those exact right words that's going to like push them over the edge into having this encounter with God, or worrying that you need to know all the answers to the inevitable hard questions that they've got planned up for you. And if you're sat here thinking, if you're sat here tonight and you're not a Christian, and you were invited here by a friend tonight, that's likely the insane thought process that went through their head before they sent you that text or asked you in person to do so. Even now, as training to be a vicar, I still go through this silly process in my head. Well, it feels like a silly process in my head anyway. But one thing that has changed is that now I know that the best thing that I can talk to people about is not to talk about some abstract thing that I don't really know about, some crazy theology stuff that I just don't get, but about something that I definitely do know. And that's my personal relationship with Jesus and the experiences that I've had whilst following him. And I wanted to share with you guys just some simple steps on how to do that as I've been reflecting about kind of the process that I go through when thinking about how to have that conversation, how to talk to them. And the first thing that I do in every situation, or at least try to do in every situation, is to pray. Before I meet somebody, when I'm with them, afterwards as well. And it's something that I've had to learn how to do over the years. Firstly, one of the major things I've done when I'm praying before I meet somebody is, God, would you put somebody in my path that I could speak to? And over the last 2 years that I've been here, I've tried to do that. And he has put people in my path that I could speak to. And then when I'm sat with those people, sometimes I can get a little bit stressed, a little bit nervous, and my heart starts pumping a bit harder. And so again, I'm just praying, asking God to calm me down a bit whilst I'm doing that, to clear my mind, just to speak the words that he gives me rather than trying to make up something that I don't really know about. And then afterwards, again, as I walk away, I'll just pray, God, if I've said anything stupid there, which is likely, you know who I am, would you just make that disappear from that person's mind and only let them focus on the good things that you've done. The other thing that I think is super important is to be open. People will most relate to your kind of personal life. Those feelings of searching, of loss, of wanting to have control over things, of waiting. Those points where you say things like, I always thought I was going to be happy when I reached this point or that point. People can relate to that. Those things like peace or fear, forgiveness, all those different steps. And it's so helpful to do that. So I will quite often, when I'm meeting with someone, just be as open about my life as I can. If they ask any question to me, then I'm going to give them the answer to that. And you have to be discerning about, what's the sort of right thing to say in that situation. Because it may be that opening that up is painful for you as well. But if you feel comfortable to do so, they're likely to connect with you through that. And then you can talk about how Jesus influenced that as well. Third thing, make Jesus the hero. Absolutely talk about yourself, what life is like for you, your context growing up. People really need to relate to you as a normal human being, even if you're not. However, our story is really about how Jesus brought us into his story and made us part of his life. So how is Jesus the hero in your life story? Were there any key moments where you responded to him or ignored him? Those sorts of things. People like to know about what's going on there. How did he finally win you over to start with? What was that moment where he brought you into his story? But the story isn't just that Jesus found you, but also the ways that he showed you what he's like. What do you love about Jesus Christ? I love to talk about how gracious he is to me, how kind he's been to me, how amazingly patient he is with me in those moments when, frankly, anybody else would have stormed away in a big huff. I would storm away from me. I've got no patience. It's an absolute nightmare. And don't talk too much about big concepts like faith or church or Christianity. I recently had this encounter with a young lad, and we've been chatting a bit over the last few weeks about different aspects of the Christian faith, and he was telling me about how much peace he had found in his life since he'd been praying and spending time with God. and even watching some of these alpha videos in his own time. And then he asked me a question about how church structure works. And I was like, dude, if you listen to me talk about this, you're going to hate it, and it will just ruin it. And he was like, no, I want to know. So I told him, and I just watched as his eyes completely glazed over. And afterwards, I was like, what did that feel like? And he's like, I felt the joy seep out of me. So don't talk about church. Talk about Jesus. Avoid all those other things. 4, use normal language. When you spend a lot of time around Christians, you will learn to say things that other Christians understand, but normal people have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. We like to call this Christianese. Even that in itself is Christianese. Non-Christian people wouldn't know what that means. It's nonsense, isn't it? It's kind of like, not tautological. Oxymoronic. There we go. That's a big word for you. But it's not a Christian word, though. And again, I was literally sat chatting to this guy the other day, and I said the word nativity, and he was just like, what? He didn't know what the nativity was, because people who have no reference for the Christian faith don't know what these words mean. So we need to find a way to talk about these things in a way that people are going to understand. Just imagine for a moment that you couldn't use the word sin in your story, or Christianity, or the gospel, or I gave my life to the Lord. Could you talk about these things without using those words? Because we really need to be able to. Otherwise, people are just not going to get it at all. And finally, 5, bring all the tricky questions back to Jesus. People will undoubtedly ask you difficult questions about faith, and they will prod and they will probe because they want to know the answers. And there is nothing wrong with that. They're not being awkward because they're curious. Why wouldn't they be curious? They don't know what's going on in the Christian faith, or if they have seen something in the media, it may be something that they just want to know a bit more about. What's the Christian perspective on that? Although you will always get the odd one that just really wants to argue with you, and yeah, sometimes it's not worth sort of wasting your energy on that. But when things start to head off in tricky directions, it can be helpful to draw it back to something like, well, if there is a God, would we want him to be like Jesus? Or just talk about Jesus again. It's very easy to just say, do you know what? I actually don't know the answer to that question. I'm not sure. But I'll tell you what I do know. This is what Jesus has done. This is what Jesus looks like. And remember, trust God will work. I didn't put that on there, but I think it's one of the most important things to do. Just trust that he's going to do something. He's put you in that situation. So if we believe the promise that God makes all things work together for the good of those that love him, then we have to trust that something is going to take place there. And it may not happen there and then. It may happen 20 years down the line in that person's life. But we trust him nonetheless. It's okay if people aren't interested in your faith story. That is totally fine. Trust God. My third and final point, because this is a good Church of England sermon, 3-point sermon. That's how it's done, guys. Why go? Why bother going to start with? Paul's final question to the Romans is this: how can anyone go and tell those who don't know Jesus without being sent? How beautiful are the feet of messengers who bring good news. Now, if you are a Christian person here tonight, if you do follow Jesus already, then know that you have been sent. Jesus has invited us into his story so that we might go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. It doesn't get much clearer than that as a mandate for what it is that we do. We can't stay silent about Jesus. We can't just let this incredible news slip by when we have opportunities in front of us all the time. And at Christmas time, it's like the work has been done for you. There are so many opportunities to talk about Jesus at Christmas because the clue is in the name. You could just start saying that to people to sort of freak them out. Christ Mass. Oh, why are you saying it that way? Good question. Let me tell you about this guy called Jesus. Or alternatively, invite them to a carol service that you're aware of, or invite them to come to one of the Christmas Eve or Christmas Day services. Like, we might have done our carol services now, but we've still got 3 services left before Christmas Day. Why not invite someone to come and spark up a conversation about Christmas? Maybe they've never heard this story before. My experience is starting to teach me that people haven't heard this story. How can they know if they've never heard? And if you're not a Christian here this evening, great to have you with us. Hope you feel really welcome. Then what I'd love for you to know is that this story of Jesus, this man that we've been talking about, this person that we believe is the Son of God, like how crazy is that? Like he's literally like God made into a man. This is good news for you. If you imagine where God might have chosen to have been born in this world, like the God, we believe this God is like the God of the universe, creator of everything, king over all of us. We call him king, we call him Lord of Lords, all these things. Like you would probably think he'd be born somewhere like a big palace, well, somewhere fancy, like the top of the Eiffel Tower. Obviously, Eiffel Tower wasn't around then, but I digress. Somewhere amazing. And yet instead, this creator God, this king over all the universe, decided to have his incarnate self, his like human form self, born in a manger, in a stable, in the Middle East, where it was probably cold and muddy and smelly and just a complete mess, to be honest. Like, I can't imagine anybody here, any ladies here, would want to be giving birth in a stable, would you? Pretty unhygienic. But what this shows us about our God is that he is born into the mess of this world. He's not like unused to being around mess. And sometimes our lives are a mess. And that's why we can be confident that he wants to be part of that too. He knows what it feels like to be broken. He knows what it feels like to fall apart. He knows what it feels like to cry and to long for things because he's born into the mess. And that is something that I would love for you to know this evening, because at the end of his life, it was a mess as well. He was taken away after doing amazing things by the authorities because they didn't like him, because he was too perfect for them, because he did good things instead of just trying to stick to a rule book that they had set before him, and was crucified on a hill, and that was pretty messy. Jesus knows what it feels like to be in the mess. And yet 3 days later, he came out of that messy situation and he rose again so that our lives don't have to be a mess. He takes our mess so that we can become clean, so that we can know something of his grace, of his love, of his kindness, and so that we might experience freedom in our lives as well. This is the God that we worship. This is the God that we talk about. He's a relational God. He wants to know us. He wants to be part of our lives. And he wants to be involved in the good stuff and the bad stuff as well, because he can turn the bad stuff around into good. Can I invite you to stand?